Well, it's my real pleasure to introduce this crew of folks out of Eastern Oregon. Katie, Dustin, and Vanessa are all based out of the Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center in Burns, Oregon. And I was very privileged in a previous position to work in that same facility with them and get to know them. And I can't say enough good things about their approach to conservation and their respect for the rural communities of Eastern Oregon, and really makes their work effective. We have two of the three joining us this morning here. Katie and Vanessa just joined us on camera, and more formally, Katie is an assistant professor of practice and rangeland fire specialist with the Extension Fire Program at Oregon State University, and her research really focuses on integrated range and fire management, landscape scale planning for improved fire outcomes, and social and ecological fire resilience in rangeland communities. And Vanessa is a senior faculty research assistant for Oregon State University Extension Service. Her extension and research programming focuses on rangeland ecology to support wildlife habitat. She spends about half her time on stakeholder-driven applied research and the other half advancing education and outreach programs around sagebrush ecosystem. So I'll hand it over to you, Katie and Vanessa, and thanks so much for joining us to talk through a real life example.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So we've heard from folks today about kind of the why behind, conserving the sagebrush ecosystem, the threat of invasive annual grasses. And so we were asked to share a real life example of, ways that groups of people, multiple organizations can do this in the real world. Jeremy had mentioned the philosophy of CORE, and so how do we make that actionable? And this brings our attention to a very real challenge, which is a lot of the sagebrush ecosystem is multi-jurisdictional, and so that necessitates fundamentally that multiple individuals and organizations are coordinating and also prioritizing their conservation actions so that they are strategic. Chad mentions the need for that, and that they make a difference not only on the landscape, so across space, but also time. These issues are unfolding over really long timescales. And so today we're going to share a little bit on what our group is called threat-based strategic conservation. And this asks two fundamental questions. First, where is conservation likely to make a difference and be successful? And so where is in quotes, because it's a place, but it's also a combination of conditions that we're going to talk about in a moment. And the second bit is then, once you have your where, what actually must occur to address threats and support ecosystem integrity. And when we talk about the what, we're not just, thinking about treatments. We also need to pay some attention to the different types of work, maybe social and administrative, in addition to ecological, that would need to occur in these places, identifying by whom, so what organizations need to be involved, at what levels of those organizations, now and also in the future. So we're tending to that temporal aspect of these challenges. And so we've put together a series of threat-based strategic conservation workshops, and we've led participants through, it's a hands-on interactive process using a lot of spatial data, thinking through, what makes sense for their groups to be proactive so that, again, the actions they choose to undertake are strategic and make a difference at the landscape scale and, again, across time and also institutions. If you'd like to learn more about this, go ahead and scan this QR code, and we'll also have this on our final slide. And so we've done this through two workshops. And so often we have mixed stakeholder groups who've convened around maybe a specific issue like sage grouse or a wildfire collaborative, as we've done in Southeastern Oregon recently. And the idea is to ultimately develop a science-informed, locally derived spatial strategy to defend and grow core rangelands. Everything that they choose to do is strategic and matters. And so this is broken up into two workshops. the first one is identifying, as I said last slide, the where. So where is a workable scale for all of those different individuals and organizations to be working together? And then in the second workshop, we asked them to apply these principles of threat-based strategic conservation, focusing on the why, focusing on defending and growing the core, to actually develop a spatial strategy for a specific geography. And Vanessa's going to walk us through that in a little bit. And so taking on that question of where, so where is conservation likely to make a difference and be successful? And so again, it's not just a geography, it's a combination of conditions that supports collective functioning of these mixed stakeholder groups. And so the right scale for doing strategic conservation, it first must be strategic. And so this hinges on the thought that we've heard again and again this morning. We can't work everywhere. We can't do all the work all the time. We have to make an effort to consciously choose work that will make a difference, again, at larger spatial scales and also across time. The right scale must also be workable. And what we mean by this is it has to be actionable. And so this must be informed by real life, ecological, social, and administrative conditions. What do we have to work with to actually get work done on the ground? And so myself, Dustin Johnson, Chad Boyd put together, this is a piece of the conservation readiness framework. And essentially the quote unquote right scale for doing strategic work needs to take into account three components. The first of these is ecological importance. I hope with the presentations we've had so far today, that resonates, right? I think this, for a lot of us, this is just going to be core, where there's conditions that are important for overall ecosystem conservation. The second one is social capacity. We need to, it's easiest to work in places where there is willingness to engage and the ability to actually coordinate our actions because of those multiple jurisdictions to actually address ecosystem threats. The third piece of this framework is administrative conditions. And so we refer to these as rules and tools. And so those rules are going to be rules that might constrain or enable actions in these places. And so in a lot of cases, this is going to be whether there's NEPA clearance. This is also just land ownerships, right? A private landowner cannot do treatments on public lands and vice versa. And then the tools piece of this are just resources to actually do the work in these places. And so when you align all of these, the idea is right there in the center where social capacity, conducive administrative conditions, and ecological importance all overlap. Those are areas that are ready to go. We can actually walk out the door and enact strategic conservation. It is an area of conservation readiness. In contrast, we have up here these places of perhaps opportunistic conservation. And we highlight this because this does happen from time to time, which is we may not be working in the places that are most perhaps ecologically important, but we have maybe willing landowners to participate, or we have NEPA clearance or program funds to do work on the ground. And so the thought here is, what we encourage is people are really thoughtful about these three conditions in where they choose to work or what conditions are on the ground when taking on work. And so ideally, we want to work right in the middle here, where you have the overlap of all three, where strategic collective work is currently or perhaps could become possible. But we're also reasonable people, and we know that that's not always the case where we have all three things. And so thinking about these three components, it can also be a diagnostic exercise. So what would need to be present in these places for strategic conservation to be possible? And so in instances where we have social capacity in areas of ecological importance, I'd mentioned the types of work that groups might choose to undertake. They might want to turn their attention to creating those conducive administrative conditions. And so, what in the future, what funding opportunities or perhaps NEPA clearance would be necessary so that we're making that area ready for actionable conservation. Likewise, we might have areas of ecological importance, and we do have a lot of funding perhaps going to those areas. I think right now, 2024, that's very much the case. But one thing some organizations like NRCS might struggle with is if there aren't interested landowners, for example, there's a lack of social capacity, a lack of interest in working together to enact strategic conservation. And when that's the case, again, thinking about the types of work that we should turn our attention to, it's going to be something more like building social capacity before, again, we are truly working in that middle area. And so now we're going to transition to sharing an example of a group that did these workshops with us. This is out of Crook County, Oregon, the Prineville Local Implementation Team, the LIT. The purpose of it is to provide a forum for collaboration to support sage grouse populations in the area and reach habitat management objectives. And so this group has been together for a couple of years now, and they've been working through identifying, prioritizing, and then implementing ideally landscape level activities with the idea that these actions will help maintain and enhance culturally, economically, and ecologically public and private rangelands that can also support sage grouse. So we're really grateful that the Prineville LIT was willing to let us share what they did with us using this framework. And so here's Crook County in Oregon. The Prineville LIT area is 2.98 million acres. This is the very northern part of the Great Basin. And so the first thing, we talked about the right scale. And so we want to flag 2.98 million acres is way too big of a geography to do meaningful coordinated work, right? It comes back to we can't do work everywhere, and almost 3 million acres is just unreasonable, right? And so the question here is, how do you hone in on the places, activities where actions will be most strategic for influencing landscape scale dynamics and addressing those ecosystem threats? And so first step, you'll recognize that circle from the Venn diagram, ecological importance. And so how is that mapped in an area like the Prineville LIT? So luckily, it's a sage grouse focused group, and so they use Oregon's priority areas for conservation, the PACs. Those are the yellow lines here on the map. They were identified by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and partners, and these are areas considered essential for sage grouse conservation. And so layering up, just to further refine ecological importance, you might recognize this visual from the sagebrush conservation design that Chad Boyd mentioned earlier this morning, the 2022 product. And the reason that the SCD is a useful layer for the Prineville LIT to conceptualize ecological importance is the SCD kind of portrays the intactness of the sagebrush ecosystem. And so the dark blue there are core sagebrush areas, light blue are those growth opportunity areas, all relative to the bigger picture that is the sagebrush biome. And so we had the Prineville LIT map this idea of ecological importance. And then the next step was to move on to that circle of conducive administrative conditions. And so this was an interactive workshop. Here are photos from the workshop. And we had multiple individuals from agencies and organizations in Crook County and had a paper map up. We had someone running the GIS and, you know, asked folks, generally speaking, where in the Prineville LIT area are your quote unquote rules and tools? And so these are kind of high level EAs, EISs, you know, programmatic coverage, like where generally do they cover in these areas? And so we had, you know, BLM, SWCD, NRCS, all delineating, again, generally not thinking about individual landowners within this project area. And we started to see that there's kind of some hot spots where there's a lot of stuff going on, especially in this east side of the project area. So you can see all those different pinks and purples. That's the overlap of all these program offerings, like where are there currently conducive administrative conditions to actually doing work together. And so thinking back to that ecological importance bubble, so we have the pack to the far east there, where the SCD had some dark blue, and then also where we had a lot of these administrative conditions on the ground. So we're starting to get an idea of where that overlap exists. That final circle is a little bit squirrely. It's hard to kind of figure these out or map it with a group, but social capacity, and I think a lot of people on this call inherently know this, is essential to actually doing work in a place, unless you have, a single land ownership. And so in this case, for the Prineville LIT, we asked them to reflect again with the paper maps, where do they have a lot of engagement in NRCS and SWCD programs, the Watershed Council, where is there a lot of participation in local landowner groups like the Rangeland Fire Protection Associations? Where has there been a history of cross-boundary projects, maybe some collaboration between BLM and the U.S. Forest Service? And then, people instinctively, they've been participating in the LIT over time, where do they feel like they have traction on the ground? And so we asked this group to conceptualize that. And indeed, we kind of have this overlap of all three conditions to create the quote unquote right scale for the Prineville LIT to at least begin to start work in their 2.98 million acre area, with the thought that this is in the realm of ecological importance. What they do in this spot will matter in terms of the overall ecosystem integrity. And the thought that they currently have social capacity and conducive administrative conditions to actually do work. And so we're going to move on to the second workshop. Vanessa's going to walk us through that. But so the Prineville LIT defined a workable scale. That's the where conservation is likely to be successful. So again, not only a geography, but also conditions on the ground. And so next, what must occur is to address threats and support ecosystem integrity. And so reflecting on the types of work that may need to happen in those places, that who does it, at what level it occurs, now or in the future. And so in short, as I turn it over to Vanessa, how do groups act strategically across space, time, and institutions? Our answer to that has been develop the spatial strategy within their right scale.
Great. Thank you, Katie. And so I have the opportunity for the next several slides to really take you through this handy dandy triangle that we have here that talks you through the 4 different steps that are really involved in developing a spatial strategy, continuing to use that Prineville LIT as an example. Great, so step 1 in the process, we're highlighted here in yellow on the left, and this step is planning, defining the core, growth opportunities, and the impacted rangelands. And so on the right, you can see that sagebrush conservation design, and highlighted in yellow is that area that we have all of that overlap of the 3 circles that Katie talked about. And with the sagebrush conservation design that Chad mentioned earlier, I do want to reiterate that this is a biome-wide product. And as we zoom into smaller geographies, we really need to use finer scale tools. So it's just really too coarse to meaningfully inform the step of defining the core and the growth areas, as I'm about to take you through. And so I do want to say, though, the SCD, now pictured on the left, it really is useful for situating the local scale conceptions of ecological integrity within the bigger picture of the sagebrush biome. But it's just too coarse for creating a spatial strategy on the ground at these scales. And so this focal area, that yellow, that's 750,000 acres still. So although big, this is still a smaller scale than the whole biome. And so at the smaller scale, we really need to use a different tool. For this, we use the ecostate maps. So these are created by the Institute of Natural Resources, so INR. And I don't have the time to go into the nitty gritty behind the maps, but these are great maps. So I really encourage you to pull up your phone and scan that QR code. It's going to take you to this really cool story map that really has all of the details behind it. And it's now going out beyond just Oregon. But for our purposes today, the greens, the green pixels, those are the really good conditioned shrubland. So that concept of core that Jeremy was talking about. There's an example of which in the top right corner of the slide. And then you have the pinks and the blues. Those are the grasslands. And then the yellows and reds, those are areas impacted by invasive annual grasses. Then we have the browns. Those are going to be our conifers. And so I really like to think about ecostates as biotic R&R. resistance and resilience that we heard about earlier, but with a biotic flair. So these are going to be areas that are really resilient to disturbances such as fire, resistant to areas that could be potentially invaded by annual grasses. So think really good perennial bunch grasses, good understory, good shrubs. Okay, so first step, we're going to delineate or map these areas of core. And so we're defining core as these large expanses of the healthy, intact sagebrush rangelands. So for this, it's going to be those green pixels here. And in this example, the Prineville LIT, they went ahead and they drew big outline around all of that green. So there's this very large polygon on the eastern side. And I do want to say that when we're defining core, we want to be more of a lumper than a splitter. So we don't want to call out these little small pockets of invasives that crop up within the core. We want these big expanses. Okay, so the next step is to really look at the areas that are growth opportunity. And so this is how the LIT mapped those in this lighter blue that's showing up on the screen. So these are areas that still have a lot of that good conditioned shrubland and grassland. So they still have a lot of those greens, some of those blues and pinks, but they're really starting to get some of those threats are expressing. The invasive annual grasses, some of those conifers, they're really starting to encroach. And so these areas, they might not be the best of the best, but these areas do have the potential to become core with some management interventions. Okay, so finally, the group mapped the areas that are heavily impacted by the threats. Many of these areas are really impacted by juniper, those brown pixels, but also by invasive annual grasses, so those reds and yellows. And I do want to stress that this was not just a mapping exercise that relied exclusively on digital pixels on a screen. The group really relied on their local knowledge of the landscape to help delineate these polygons. And it's gone through some more refinement since this image here. Okay, so for the next step, step 2, for simplicity, we're just going to focus on this one large chunk of core. That's still 305,000 acres. So for this step, we really need to determine, or the group determined, if the ecological integrity was threatened, and if yes, where and why. So in other words, what are the primary threats to ecological integrity in this 305,000 acre chunk of core rangeland? And importantly, are the threats the same throughout? So to do this, we're going to need a little bit more information. So starting here on the left, we have a map of what I'm calling abiotic R&R. And so we learned about this from Paul earlier. That stands for resistance and resilience, meaning the resistance of the landscape to invasives and resilience to disturbance such as fire. This is just looking at the abiotic concept. So soils, elevation, slope, and aspect. And so low R&R, pictured here in red, those are areas that are generally hot and dry, while the higher R&R, represented by blue, those are going to be wetter and cooler. And so the blue areas, they're at lower risk of invasive annual grasses, but higher risk of conifer expansion. While the red areas highlighted here, those areas have a higher threat of invasives, but a lower conifer threat. Then we have a lot of this yellow. The areas of yellow, they're going to be that intermediate R&R, which could indicate that both threats are at play. So actually, we need more information than just this abiotic R&R. So we brought in this third map product. This is the probability of post-fire transition to annuals. And so this is basically that abiotic R&R on the left, but layered with that biotic R&R. So the ecostates is really focused on the vegetation. And so with this information, we can really see there's a clear divide between the north and south. So what I just highlighted here is in the southern area, there's a lot of that red. The red is a high likelihood of post-fire transition to annuals. So if this burns, it's likely to convert to invasives. However, in the northern portion, there's a lot of that green. It's lower likelihood of transitioning to annuals post-fire, meaning it probably has more of a threat from conifer expansion. Great, so now that we have that division, a little more information working here. I do want to say that the Prineville LIT, they're still working through this process. So this is really far from final. What we mocked up here is really just based off of the initial conversations that the sage-grouse biologist presented to the group with sage-grouse movement and location data, which is going to be shown here very broadly in yellow. And so generally speaking, the biologist pointed out that the southern portion of the core rangelands, that unit is really critical winter habitat for sage grouse. Then they also identified areas in the western and northern portions of the unit as being highly productive spring and summer habitat for grouse. And then lastly, the LIT is really lucky to have this great collar data from a research project going on that showed connectivity between these habitats. So they were able to highlight a corridor connecting the two. So now we have these core polygons from the previous step, and then we have the values. We're just looking at grouse here, where we can create these core subunits. So on the right, you can really see how that grouse data was kind of layered onto that core map, creating these dashed lines as subunits within the core. So it's really important to note that for this step, the groups only considered delineating values that would lead to a change in management. So if the value is uniform across the core, let's say maybe pronghorn habitat as an example, we would note it as being important, but there would be no need to create subunits because the method by which we would be addressing the threats would not change. So it's important, but we wouldn't make a whole new polygon out of it. And so this leads us into step 4, which Katie is going to take over from here.
Yeah, so, Vanessa walked us through starting to hone and refine a spatial strategy, acknowledging the threats to core, and then the values that might refine different management activities that are necessary to protect that core. And so the next step here is thinking about, ecological integrity, the immediacy of the threats to start to identify the relative urgency of these actions. And so for this, and again, we haven't gotten here with Prineville LIT. And so at this point, we're in the realm of hypotheticals, but, we have this piece of core. It's fairly large, but it has been subdivided, given, again, the threats and then the values, if those values would change the management objectives for each of those units. And so we walk through each subunit here, delineated by those dotted lines, reflecting on the threats, identifying a management objective from that area, potential actions. And so we're not going in as fine scale as treatment, but this might be, stopping fire from reaching this subunit that has a high likelihood of converting to invasive annual grasses if it were to burn. After we gather all that information, and it's a literal worksheet we've done with groups can start to weigh for each of these subunits the relative urgency, because some of these threats occupy a far more a shorter time frame in terms of the effect on ecosystem integrity than others. And so an example of this, and this can be overwhelming, but think about, worksheets were filled out for each of these subunits, thinking on the threats, the goal or management objective, and then the strategies to address these objectives. And so looking at that far southern subunit, in that instance, wildfire and invasive annual grasses were the primary threats. And so the goal is we want to maintain ecological integrity. It was that unit with critical winter habitat for greater sage grouse. And so strategies are just make sure it doesn't burn. We're concerned about invasives creeping in. And so thinking about detection and eradication in those areas would be important, and controlling those existing populations of invasives. And so the thought here is if you have all this information for each of these subunits comprising this entire 300,000 plus acre area, you can start to reflect, going back to the idea that we can't work everywhere all the time. There are going to be some actions, some goals, some strategies that are going to be more urgent than others. And so one way to think about that is, we have a unit where wildfire and invading annual grasses is the primary threat. In contrast, in that far northern subunit, conifer expansion is the main threat. And so one question we would pose to groups is, we know kind of the march of conifers and the effect it has on ecosystem integrity. That takes place over many more years. We're talking a couple decades than something like invasives, increasing the probability that ignition will start a fire and that fire could potentially get big and we will lose those values forever. And so groups are asked to reflect on these and weigh the urgency of these different goals and strategies, again, relative to the threat and the value at risk given the threats. And so the final bit, we're back to the framework, is diagnosing needs. So, we've mapped out a spatial strategy, started to think about goals and strategies within each of those units, but still there's very much, if we actually are going to do work on the ground, what do we need? And so this is where we return to the framework and use it more diagnostically. So in those places where it's been deemed urgent to do some activities, what administrative conditions do we have to work with? Right? Are those wilderness study areas, or do we have some fuels NEPA so we can actually do some fuels treatments, for example? In terms of social capacity, are there folks in those areas that are ready to go? What kind of outreach might be necessary to get them on board or include their ideas in these plans? And so we have these plans for each of the units. Maybe we have both social capacity and conducive administrative conditions, and that might bump the urgency of something up the line because no actions in terms of curating social capacity or administrative conditions are necessary. If one of those are lacking, we need to refine our time frame. And again, this goes back to thinking about the different types of work that must occur. So it may not be project work. It may not be planning a juniper cut. It might be building relationships or, applying for funding, creating those tools in those areas and the administrative conditions so that work can actually get done on the ground. And so the thought is, we just showed you that one big piece of core, but applying this to each of those growth opportunity areas and even perhaps impacted areas can help you develop an entire spatial strategy for this fairly large piece of the LIT's project area. And so we're going to wrap it up there. And I want to acknowledge our partners in threat-based strategic conservation. So we're with OSU Extension, but this is in cooperation with the Agricultural Research Service here at the Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center. And then also the Institute for Natural Resources through OSU and PSU. So thanks for your time today. This is the website for more information on strategic conservation, and we're looking forward to your questions.
Great. We've got a fair amount of time here for Q&A till 12:30 when we break for lunch. So we're excited to get to it. Thank you so much, Katie and Vanessa. Our first question that we had come in is, will this training and collaborative approach be replicated in other Oregon rangeland counties like Lake County?
Sure. Yeah. So we've, that's a great question. So we actually just recently engaged within the Lake County area with the TCC as well as the Lake County local implementation team out there. And so we are doing this throughout Oregon and through the vector of the LITs, but it's going to be broader than that. We have a Teach the Teacher training that we're going to be putting on for folks who are looking to kind of be the facilitator in this process. That's going to be happening in May. And then kind of in conjunction with that, we have a training where people who just are interested in strategic conservation and other rangeland ecology topics can attend, and they'd be participants in kind of the workshop. And then the Teach the Teachers help facilitate it. So the plan is Oregon. We're engaging with a lot of different groups, and hopefully soon it'll be out beyond.
Wonderful. Related to that, we had another question come in that says, how can we get our own LIT for the lands and tributaries of the South Fork John Day River? They have some areas in mind where collaboration and landowner involvement there's high interest in participation.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm going to let Vanessa speak more specifically about something like an LIT, but in general, that's an example of high social capacity, right? And it would be a shame to let that go to waste because, we're not so lucky to have that everywhere. And so one thought is, if there's a group of landowners who are, ready to go and focused on an issue, how can they partner with other groups who can support and provide something like coordination capacity to really turn it into something that can be strategic, work with other agencies. And so it might be, maybe there is a local non-governmental organization in Southeastern Oregon. We have, for example, the High Desert Partnership, who specializes in kind of extending the capabilities of local organizations. Or it might be a agency, or in Oregon, the Nature Conservancy has been supporting collaborative efforts in the rangeland planning space. In terms of LITs, do you have any?
Yeah, I can chime in there. So LITs are local implementation teams, it's a mouthful, are really sage grouse focused. And so we're not really involved in that structure there. That's historically been, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the state have been kind of engaged in creating that and creating support in the form of coordinators. But you don't have to be an LIT for us to engage with you. So if you are, just like Katie said, if you have a lot of that social capacity, you're interested in getting kind of a collaborative put together, then groups like us can come in and help support your collaborative if you want to go through a process like this. And we can, we're hopefully going to get some more formal educational materials for people who want to facilitate it themselves. But definitely, if you're in Oregon, reach out to us if you have that collaborative rolling. We do need collaboratives to be kind of formed and in a place that's a little bit ready to start, have a vision, a mission, that type of thing before this is going to be as effective.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, great example from our Oregon partners, but it's an example, and we have other flavors of this type of planning going on. And so one of the things that Brian will mention at the end of the workshop is some next steps for our group in terms of supporting community-based planning and training other people, those local tips of the spear that want to go further with this. We're going to have some additional, more in-depth training on how to do this yourselves.
Yeah, Jeremy, you beat me to it. I was going to say there's these parallel sort of thought processes that are happening at different parts of the range, and the Oregon State example is a great one in terms of being very strategic and helping groups think through that process. We did 3 of what we're calling our level 3s this past fall in different parts, 3 different states, with a very similar intent but a slightly different approach. Although the similarities are striking to me, that these 2 things have sort of originated at the same time. It's kind of like the interesting backstory behind the double helix discovery of the DNA molecule. If you're interested in that, look it up. So we'll follow up more on that.
Our next question that we've had come in is, how do we incentivize proactive work? It makes sense from an ecology perspective to be proactive, but we need funding agencies to move away from the mindset that if it's not broke, don't fix it, so we can get this work done. Thoughts there?
I won't be shy. I just got hit over the head with a really great paper that I'll share with everyone here. It was in Restoration Ecology, just came out, and they actually looked at barriers to proactive management adoption. And it goes into a lot of the things that Katie mentioned with social and administrative culture, and provides a lot more detail than I'll be able to share. But one of the key things that jumped out to me that's a barrier is having science that validates the effectiveness of the practice. And I hear this from our district conservationists, our local folks, like, yeah, this is all great, but does anything work? And, I'm not going to go out on a limb to do something that's not going to work. So I think that was a really clear indication to me that we're going to have to do local experimentation and demonstrations to show that this can work. And once that's in place, perhaps a lot of those other conditions fall into place to make you able to be proactive. And so that's all I wanted to share there. Thanks.
Yeah, what I'm going to tag on with Jeremy, and then I think Vanessa has something to add. There's a need for institutional change. And so that is funding organizations, but also agencies rewarding or recognizing that not all valid metrics for success are acres treated, right? It is acres treated in the most meaningful places. Or like I said, sometimes the work that needs to be done isn't at all ecological. It's something else so that those areas can be ready for conservation. And so, I don't have a good answer for how you start that institutional change. But one thing we've suggested to groups, so we've been working with either formal collaboratives or multi-stakeholder groups like the LITs, why not include your spatial strategy in your application for funding to show that because there's a reason you're focusing on that place. Here are the reasons. Here are the expected outcomes. Now watch us do it, and then we can really get going, having evidence or as Jeremy said, examples that point to this is the right approach.
Yeah, so Katie covered very similar to what I was going to say, is that one of the benefits of this process for groups is it's a communication tool, it's a roadmap, and there aren't a whole lot of really well put together funding applications that have this many different partners with a laid out really clear plan. And so it might not be creating institutional change, but hopefully it's helping build the argument, at least from this side, from the management side. This is what we've thought about it. We've all agreed to this. This is strategic. We need you to fund it. So it's building a case for the funding through the spatial strategy.
But Vanessa, I will strongly support what you guys both just said. And in our segment after lunch, we're going to hear from some working groups who have benefited from exactly the approach you just described. Lay out the strategy, talk about how it fits spatially in very important areas, and they've been able to fund some very active and proactive projects that are working at very large spatial scale. So I agree with that. I do think, I'm not going to presume to speak on behalf of funding agencies, but I do think that we're starting to see some of this language bubble and diffuse into some of these RFPs and some specific offers to be more proactive and to think from a less, preserving the better places, defending, and not just going to the worst places and just tell us how many acres you treated. So maybe that's happening, and we just can't be too patient, but maybe we just need to wait it out a little bit more.
Brian, just to dogpile on that, you jumped on what I was going to say too, is that yes, it's a slow change, but that is happening. And as you mentioned, Brian, there are, funding entities in the federal government that are already informing funding decisions based on defend and grow the core proactive strategies. And, this tech transfer group and core team, we're very focused on land managers as our customer base, but, policymakers, funders, decision makers are to some degree our customer base too. And many of us actively engage in working with those folks and explaining why this is a smart strategy, talking about different metrics of success, things like that. So it is happening, and the ship is turning in some of those programs and funding entities.
This is a bit of a related question, but as invasive annual grass management efforts proceed across the landscape, is there a tracking mechanism or coordination plan to see what is and isn't working, recognizing that we don't have a lot of time and resources to make mistakes?
Maybe I'll stick my neck out a little bit on this one. So I think there are many options. In terms of concerted and coordinated efforts, there is a subgroup in phase 2 of the sagebrush conservation design that is putting together sort of a report card approach that will operate at the biome level. I don't think this is something that's I think it's going to be released in a publication soon, that is trying to track the impacts of management on the specific metric that is sagebrush ecological integrity. I will also say that then we start to drill down a little bit into more local, it's kind of across the board. I think many states are doing it differently and approaching it in their own way. And I would even say regions and localities are. We have some of these tools that offer the potential to track changes at large scales that were mentioned earlier, things like RAP and others. And then I know that there are other places that have extensive on-the-ground monitoring programs that are tracking treatment response and plant community dynamics following treatments at kind of the state level. I know we've got a monitoring network program here in Wyoming where our team provides support for that. I don't think that we have coalesced around a single approach or a single mechanism or tool by which to track the large scale impacts at this point?
I'll just tag on to what Brian was saying. So I'm more local based, right? So in Oregon, we have the Oregon Rangeland Monitoring Program, which the tie though, and maybe the tie for other states could be, is all of that information is being synced with the Land Treatment Exploration Tool, the LTET. And so there is identified a big need for all of these management actions going across the landscape and not having a uniform way to monitor what's happening with these treatments. And so that's kind of Oregon's solution. And hopefully that could be maybe a rally for other states.
I'll just add that monitoring isn't a singular thing either. We have multiple levels of what you might call monitoring. And we're going to have to do better for this moonshot effort that we're undertaking. And within each of those, I think about like at the highest level, you've got like your outcome-based evaluation monitoring, which is more experimental, large scale, long term, and it's not going to be something we do everywhere. We'll have a few petri dishes on the landscape where we learn a lot. Then we'll have really broad scale kind of standardized monitoring protocols and programs, right, that all talk to one another. But then there's this third piece I think about, which is much more on the ground for most of our participants. It's like informing your day-to-day actions. Like, did your treatment work? And are you going to have to do something again? And that's a different level of monitoring. So we're definitely talking about how to get those types of groups all talking to one another so we can cut down on the learning curve.
And I'll say the learning curve is one of the things that the Tech Transfer Partnership and others are trying to address as well, is to break down the silos to where people know what's working in one area, that we can make sure that that information flows to a different area as well, and so that we don't have people reinventing the wheel continuously. And we'll talk about that a little bit after lunch as well.
Great. This next question is a bit different. It says some Western states have up to a fourth of the population obtaining hunting and fishing licenses, and many are passionate about habitat improvement. In relation to social coordination, what have you all done to interact with the fish and game departments? In relation to that, this person is intending to author an article for a national sporting publication on this topic. What should the readers take away as the answer to what can I do about this problem?
Can I take an initial? Is that okay? I'll just speak to some of our experience. Wyoming Game and Fish is one of our biggest active partners when it comes to invasive annual grasses, and they have been for a decade or more. And part of that is something that we discussed earlier. It's not just a livestock production problem. It impacts wildlife habitat across a range of species. And to be active and proactive in management is something that I will say a lot of different wildlife organizations have really started to come online recently. I think a lot of the partners, this used to be like a weed. This used to be like a weed thing. And now it's not, right? It's much bigger than that. And I think the more we learn, the more engagement that we have from all of our different wildlife, both federal, state, and local, and NGOs as well. In some ways, it's something that they can kind of coalesce around. We may not all agree to methods or tactics, but in terms of the scale of the issue and how it spans multiple taxa, I think it stands to affect our wildlife populations as much as it does anything. And I think many, if not most, of the state level organizations probably have that same view. Every workshop we go to, there is someone there actively involved from some of the wildlife organizations, and they're often very engaged at those discussions and in the projects. That's my limited experience.
And with our Oregon workshops, trying to think, I think all of our groups have had representatives from the State Wildlife Management Agency, ODF and W, also US Fish. And the really valuable because they're providing that perspective, especially on values, right? They have an eye to what the public cares about in terms of these ecosystems. And then it also works well with our framework because, you know, we talk about this idea of ecological importance. Well, intact, healthy rangelands provide habitat for these species. So they're invested in participating and having positive outcomes. The other thing is that idea of managing for wildlife is actually a really important conceptual piece for us. You might, from our presentation a few minutes ago, once we got to creating subunits within core, that all came from this idea that not all core is created equal. There are different threats, but it's also valued for different things. Sometimes it might be uniform, but a lot of times there's a lot of heterogeneity in there. And so that information about how wildlife are using those areas, we showed that winter versus spring bird rearing habitat for sage grouse, that can really help provide some nuance in how we develop and refine those spatial strategies once we get down to strategies in the end there.
I've got to chime in with one more suggested response here, and that is recreationists often aren't directly involved in the hands-on management of this problem, pulling weeds and things like that. But as a group, they're very powerful allies nationally in giving a voice to the big empty to the west, right? Like when we have, Andrew and his team from the JV go back to DC when it's time to talk about the Farm Bill, for example, or our agency funding. These are groups that will come and help us and advocate for the conservation and restoration. If they understand the urgency and relevance to their values, it kind of gets back to the why. These are the connections to why care, and that's a very powerful group. And one example is Pheasants Forever. We don't have pheasants in sagebrush country, but they're a national hunting and conservation organization that is fully committed and is a core partner for us in our endeavor on this. They're helping fund this tech transfer partnership and sponsor it. And so this is a group that has bought in and is advocating on our behalf because they see that connection.
Well, we only have time for one, maybe two more questions. So we'll try this one. How does sagebrush management fit into defending the core strategy? The mentality seems to be to not touch sagebrush. However, preservation can result in degradation in a sagebrush ecosystem as sagebrush canopy increases, understory decreases, and therefore increases the opportunity for invasive grass establishment.
I have relatively strong opinions, so I'll try. I'll just give you an example. So Paul talked to you about the ecological interactions, and if you hit one part of the system, there's a reaction, right? If we release nutrients. And so my example here is when you drive from where I live in Bend to Burns, Oregon, it's about a couple hours in Eastern Oregon. The highway department's mowed along the roadsides. They mow the sagebrush to reduce wildfire risk, theoretically. What they've done is released cheatgrass in the understory, right? So you take one part of the system out and you got this flush of nutrients, and we got a lot more invasive annuals. So my point is, it kind of depends on what players you have in the system to begin with. If you don't have annuals, then, and you're just shuffling out your perennial plants, maybe there's less of a concern. But in many of our systems, that is a component, and literally something we should be thinking about with every vegetation manipulation we're doing is what's going to be that response of our invasive annuals. So if you're going to consider that as part of your strategy, you better couple it with some weed control tactics and tools.
Mm-hmm. And tagging on to Jeremy, something like our spatial strategy can be helpful for that. You might remember in step 2, Vanessa showed that R&R layer. And so that can tell us something about how a site would recover if there were disturbance, such as mowing for sagebrush. And so if you're thinking about, I want to reduce hazardous fuels like sagebrush to reduce burn severity in these places, you might start with sites where there's going to be relatively higher R&R. So something like dragging a mower through there isn't going to have the consequences Jeremy described of just trading one problem, heavy hazardous fuels, for, you know, your fine fuels invaded site.
I know we're bumping up against lunch. I will also point back to Paul said we're talking about managing a plant community. We're not just talking about killing bad guys. And I think this is a great question that illustrates that. And part of your risk reward calculation should think about, you know, what as Jeremy and Katie also said, is what are you starting with and what is your risk of making it worse? But we do know that if you get large, old, incredibly dense, decadent stands of sagebrush, you're going to potentially lose the understory. So I think we're talking about managing for healthy sagebrush grassland communities, not only, or not simply thinking about managing annual grasses, because then we start getting into that single species management trap that we've seen that doesn't work very well in many different cases. So that's my 2 cents here at the end.